Before you decide whether God still speaks through dreams, consider what the Church believed for the first 1500 years of its existence. Not the fringe, not the mystics at the edges, the theologians, the martyrs, the desert mothers and fathers, the bishops and the scholars. The people who gave us the creeds, the canon, and the contemplative tradition that shape Christian spirituality to this day. None of them thought God had stopped speaking in the night. The question was never whether they were. It was how well to listen to what God was saying through dreams. I'm Angela Meer, and I welcome you into the sacred meeting place of psychology and theology, where the timeless patterns of Scripture meet the deep symbols of the soul. Last week, we established the biblical ground. God has always spoken through dreams, from the patriarchs to the prophets to the apostles. The scripture is saturated with it, but I want to pause before we build the practice because I know some of you are carrying an objection. Maybe you have already heard it from someone in your life, or maybe it lives in your own chest. That was then. That was the Bible. That was before we had the full revelation of scripture. God doesn't need to speak in dreams anymore. But, I want to show you something in both last week and this week's podcast and articles episodes to let you know that this is not what the church believed. In fact, this is only a new invention of the church from 19th century on. It is what the modern Western evangelical church believes, but not what the church believed for the first 1500 years of its existence. Because the assumption that God has stopped speaking in dreams is not the historic Christian perspective. It is the newest position in the room. And we have been in this Christian contemplative journey for 2,000 years. So let me introduce you to some people so that you can understand that historically, dreams have been a big aspect of Christian existence. It's time to awaken holy wonder. Stay with me. Welcome to the Christian Jung. I'm Angela Meer. I'm a PhD theology student with 2 advanced degrees in Carl Jung's psychology. In my own longing for a deeply transformative Christian experience, I found that the psychologist Carl Jung had already provided us with tools that are deeply biblical and aligned with the Christian faith. The rich spiritual tradition that we inherited from the Celtic saints, the Desert Fathers, and the Book of Acts is available for us today. Let's journey together as we discover the spirit in Christianity and water the dry, aching areas of our soul. Around the year 210 AD, Tertullian of Carthage wrote a treatise called De Anima, on the soul. Tertullian was not a fringe figure. He was the first major Christian theologian to write in Latin. He gave the church the word Trinity, and he wrote a theology of dreams. He categorized 3 kinds: divine dreams sent from God, demonic dreams counterfeited by the enemy, and natural dreams arising from the soul's own activity during sleep. This categorization is significant not for what it says about demons or natural psychology, but for what it assumes, that divine dreams do exist, that God sends them, that the question requiring serious theological thought is not whether divine dreams happen, but how to tell them from their counterfeits. This is where the church begins its teaching on dreams, not with skepticism, with discernment. The framework presupposes the phenomenon. You do not develop a sophisticated theology of distinguishing genuine divine dreams from counterfeit ones if you believe there are no genuine divine dreams to distinguish. Tertullian believed there were, so did the entire theological tradition he was writing within and for. 3 years before Tertullian finished De Anima in the year 203 AD, a young noblewoman named Vibia Perpetua was arrested in Carthage for refusing to renounce her Christian faith. She was 22 years old, nursing an infant. She was sentenced to die in the arena. While she waited in prison, she dreamed, and she wrote those dreams down. In the first dream, she climbed a golden ladder that reached to the heavens. Its sides were lined with iron weapons, swords, lances, hooks that would tear the flesh of anyone who climbed carelessly. A great dragon lay at the foot of the ladder. She stepped on the dragon's head and climbed. At the top, she found a vast garden and a gray-haired shepherd who offered her a mouthful of sweet milk. She woke with the taste still in her mouth, and she understood. She would not leave the arena alive. Notice what this dream does. It gives her information about her future, information that she needed to give her the courage for the things that were coming in her future. It gave her also the presence of the shepherd at the top of the ladder. So he wasn't distant from her in this situation she was in. He was there with her in her martyrdom, offering her milk and welcoming her. The dream did not merely tell her what was coming. It accompanied her into it, gave her the courage she needed to go through it. Perpetua continued to dream. She dreamed of her dead brother Dinocratus, first suffering in darkness, then healed and playing in light after her prayer. She dreamed of a combat in the arena in which she became a man and defeated a great adversary, and she understood the battle ahead was spiritual, not merely physical, and that she had already been shown the outcome. She was indeed killed in the arena on March 7th, 203 AD, at 22 years old. The Church preserved her account. For centuries, it was read publicly in North African worship services. Tertullian, who may have written the preface to her Passion, called it new prophecy, not lesser than what the apostles received, but continuous with it. The Church did not treat Perpetua's dreams as interesting historical curiosity. It treated them as a testimony of a martyr prophet receiving genuine divine communication in the hours before her death. This is not the fringe. This is the center of our Christian tradition. A 22-year-old woman in prison dreaming, writing it down, and the church saying, this is worth preserving. Read it in worship. This is what God sounds like. Then we have a century after Perpetua, we have the Egyptian desert, which began to fill with men and women who had gone into the wilderness to pursue God with undivided attention. They gave Christian civilization the monastic tradition, the tradition that preserved learning and faith through the collapse of Rome, that produced every major renewal movement in Western Christianity for 1,000 years. The Sayings of the Desert Fathers is a foundational text of all subsequent Christian monasticism. It contains repeated references to dreams as vehicles of divine communication, warning, and formation. But what is more significant than any individual dream account is the posture the tradition developed toward interior experience. They called it nepsis, watchful attentiveness to interior movement. Not passive reception, not credulous assumption of everything that comes, but disciplined, prayerful attention to the movements of the soul, including the movements that come in the night, with the constant question, where is this from? Is this God? Is this the enemy? Or is this just somatic? This discernment tradition is sophisticated precisely because it presupposes divine communication. You do not develop a discipline of distinguishing genuine interior movement from counterfeit if you believe there is no genuine interior movement to distinguish. The Desert Fathers were not naive. They were among the most rigorous interior practitioners in Christian history, and they took the night seriously. Antony the Great, the father of Christian monasticism, whose life Athanasius wrote and the whole church read, entered the desert shaped by visionary experience. The tradition he founded produced the most sophisticated theology of internal discernment in Christian history. That theology assumed God speaks. Its entire sophistication was devoted to developing the capacity to hear accurately. Monica, the mother of Augustine of Hippo, prayed for her son's conversion for 17 years. Early in those years, she had a dream. A radiant young man appeared to her weeping and asked why she grieved. She told him she was mourning the ruin of her son. He told her to look, and she saw that where she stood, Augustine was standing beside her. She held the dream for 17 years as a promise from God. While her son was deep in his own sin and later in Neoplatonism, when he moved to Rome and then to Milan, while he lived with a mistress and had a son and pursued a distinguished academic career without any apparent motion toward Christian faith, she held the dream. Augustine eventually converted. He records Monica's dreams in the Confession with full seriousness, not as his mother's delusion, not as wish fulfillment, as genuine divine communication that sustained a mother's intercession through years of apparent failure. Monica believed the dream was from God. Augustine, the greatest theologian the Western Church produced, records that belief as reasonable and well founded. Augustine himself engaged with the question of dreams in multiple works. His position is always nuanced. He applies careful reasoning to questions of what can be trusted and how, but he never suggests that God has stopped communicating through dreams. The question, as far as Tertullian and the desert tradition, is always one of discernment. How do we receive accurately? Not, has God stopped sending dreams? Jerome. Jerome translated the Hebrew and Greek scriptures into Latin. The Vulgate, his translation, shaped Western Christianity for a millennium. It is arguably the single most influential act of scholarship in the history of the Western Church. And Jerome was also redirected by a dream. He was an avid reader of Cicero and the classical authors, so passionate about literary style that he had been neglecting scripture. In the dream, he was brought before a heavenly tribunal. Asked to identify himself, he said, "I am a Christian." The judge replied, "You lie. You are a Ciceronian, not a Christian. For where your treasure is, there your heart is also." He was flogged before the tribunal. He woke in tears. He says the bruises were real. He spent the next decades translating scripture with the passion he had previously given to Cicero. The man who gave the Western Church its Bible was shaped by what came in the night. In 1521, a young Spanish soldier named Ignacio de Loyola was struck by a cannonball at Pamplona. Both legs were shattered. During his long convalescence, he asked for books of romance. The castle had none. He was given a life of Christ and a collection of saints' lives instead. He read them, and he began to notice something. When he imagined imitating the knights of chivalry, he felt a surge of energy. But when the daydream ended, he felt flat and empty. When he imagined imitating the saints, the energy lasted after the imagination ended. It deepened rather than faded. Something was different about these two streams of interior movement. And Ignatius, not yet a theologian, barely yet a serious Christian, began to pay attention to the difference. He spent years developing what he began to notice. The spiritual exercises, published in 1548, are the result. They are a 30-day structured retreat organized around one central insight. God communicates through the interior movement, and the soul can be trained to recognize, attend to, and respond to that communication with increasing accuracy. The primary practice of the exercises is what Ignatius calls the application of the senses. The person takes a gospel scene, for instance, the Nativity, the baptism of Jesus, the raising of Nazareth, and enters it with all five senses, not to analyze it, but to be present in it, to see what is seen, hear what is heard, smell the stable, touch the ground, taste the air, and then to notice what arises, what feelings, what movements of consolation or desolation, what sense of God drawing near or pulling away. Consolation draws toward God, toward love, peace, holy desire, the increase of faith. Desolation draws away toward anxiety, self-absorption, darkness, the diminishment of charity. Ignatius wrote rules for distinguishing them, 14 rules in the first week, 8 more advanced rules in the second week. The rules do not tell the person what God is saying. They give tools for recognizing the signature of the genuine divine movement versus the signature of its counterfeit. The spiritual exercises have been used continuously for 5 centuries by Jesuits, by religious sisters, by lay people, by people of every tradition, by millions of people across 500 years who have found them in a structured way of attending to what God is doing in the interior life. Now, let's enter Carl Jung. Carl Jung read the spiritual exercises by Ignatius, and in 1937 he delivered the Terry Lectures at Yale University. later published as Psychology and Religion. In those lectures, he engaged with the Jesuit method of meditation at length. He recognized immediately what he was looking at. Ignatius's imaginative contemplation, which is entering a sacred scene with all five senses, attending to what arises without forcing a predetermined outcome, was structurally identical to what Jung was developing as active imagination, the deliberate receptive engagement with an interior image, the attending to what arises, the distinguishing of genuine movement from counterfeit. The difference was the frame. Ignatius held the practice within a theological frame. The image is a gift from God. The movements of consolation and desolation are the language of the Spirit. The goal is union with the will of God. Jung held the same practice within a psychological frame. The image arises within the unconscious. The movements of the psyche carry information about the self, and the goal is individuation. The practice was the same, but the vocabulary was different. Jung was honest about the recognition. He did not claim to have invented this method. He claimed to have given it new language that made it accessible to people who could no longer receive it in its original theological packaging. He understood that what Ignatius had built was not merely a spiritual technique, but a sophisticated technology for engaging the non-rational interior life, for attending to what moves beneath the surface of conscious thought, for developing the capacity to recognize genuine movement from counterfeit. The Church has been doing it for 5 centuries before Jung named it. Ignatius learned it from the desert tradition, which learned it from the martyrs and the apostles, who received it from a God who has always spoken through the interior life of his people. If the early Church, the desert tradition, the medieval Church, and Ignatius all took dreams and interior communication seriously, how did we end up with a Christianity that dismisses it? The answer is not primarily theological. It is cultural. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries produced an intellectual culture that privileged rational, propositional, empirical knowledge over experiential and imaginal modes of knowing. Dreams were reclassified as random neurological noise, or at best, psychological phenomena. The interior life was no longer a site of divine speech. It was a biological process. Protestant Christianity, reacting against what it perceived as Catholic excess in mysticism and visionary experience, drew sharper lines. The canon is closed. The apostolic age is over. We have the Bible. We do not need dreams, is what they said. This hardens into formal cessationism, the argument that certain gifts of the Spirit ceased with the apostolic age in the 19th century. It is associated with the Princeton theologians, particularly B.B. Warfield. It is not the patristic position. It is not the medieval position. It is not even consistently the Reformation position. Calvin wrote that God communicates through dreams, and Luther did not dismiss them. We inherited a cessationism that the early church would not recognize, presented as Orthodox Christianity. The church that preserved Perpetua's dreams for public worship did not believe it. Tertullian did not believe it. Augustine did not believe it. Jerome did not believe it. Ignatius did not believe it. And Jung, outside the faith, looking at what the faith had built, recognized that what had been dismissed was doing something genuinely important for the human soul. We did not inherit a skeptical Christianity. We inherited a dreaming one, and someone told us to stop. Acts 2:17, in the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Peter quotes Joel at Pentecost. He is not describing the apostolic age as a brief exception to God's normal silence. He is describing the age inaugurated by the poured out Spirit, an age that has not ended, in which the normal expectation is that God speaks to all people through the interior life, including the night. We are in that age. The Spirit has been poured out. The dreams and visions are part of what the pouring out produces. What we are talking about is not novelty. It is actually a recovery of actual serious Christianity. Tertullian, Perpetua, the Desert Fathers, Monica, Jerome, Hildegard, Aquinas, Ignatius, a 2,000-year tradition of the church receiving, discerning, and living from what God sends in the night. This is your inheritance, not what you were told, what the church actually believed. This is your time to receive it. Let us close with a moment to pause, pray, and heal. Take a moment and think about, what did you receive your assumptions about dreams? Was it explicitly taught or absorbed from a culture that assumed it without argument? Sit with that. Notice where the assumption came from. It did not come from the early church. It did not come from the Bible. It did not even come through 1,500 years of tradition. What I'd like you to do now is to pray in the spirit of Acts 2:17 and the tradition that stands behind it. Lord, I want to receive my full inheritance, not a Christianity narrowed by Enlightenment rationalism, not a faith more comfortable with the silence of God than with his speech. Pour out your Spirit on me, on my waking hours and my sleeping ones. Speak in the night as you have always spoken. I am willing to hear what you have always been willing to say. This week, I want you to heal by reading the account of Perpetua's first dream. Just that one. Read it slowly as if you are reading the testimony of a martyr prophet, which is exactly what it is. Notice what it is like to receive a 22-year-old woman's dream, a serious theological testimony. Notice what opens in you when you allow it to be just that. Subscribe to the Christian Jung podcast wherever you listen, and find the full article in this week's Inner Room piece on the Ignatian discernment framework and how to apply it to your own dream work on Substack at the Christian Jung. You can also find me at angelameer.com. Next week, we begin to build the practice. The history is behind us, the tradition is now available to us, and we're going to use it. So this week, as we conclude this week's podcast and article, we want to say, this is your time to awaken holy wonder. We'll see you next week. Podcasts like this grow slowly, soul to soul, heart to heart. If it helped you, consider helping it find someone else. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share.